It all started after the end of apartheid. The new South Africa wants her back. It was the beginning of the 19th century. She was a young woman coming from far away. She's been both a servant and a great attraction. She's been both a Venus and an exotic freak. A cartoon and a song, a vaudeville and a book. She's been a woman and she's been an ape. How could the same person play so many different parts? She was like a beast, drawn, measured and chopped, then preciously preserved in a French museum. Even in death, she was given no rest. Now she is in Paris, at the Musée de l'Homme. In case number 33, they keep her skeleton. Why is she considered a symbol? Her name is Sara Baartman, and this is her story. Sara Baartman was born in South Africa in this vast, tranquil landscape that is the Eastern Cape. She belonged to the Khoikhoi, a nomadic people who had roamed freely across this land for centuries. From north to south, east to west, they wandered in search of greener grazing pastures for their livestock. They lived in caves on which they recorded their lives and history. But in 1790, the tranquility of this place had long since been shattered by the brutal arrival of the Europeans. And at the time of Sara's birth, her people, the Khoikhoi, were engaged in a guerrilla war against the encroaching Dutch. This meant that the men lived in mountains, ever watchful of the feared commando raids. This also meant that only the women, children, and the old were left in the villages to fend for themselves. Sara was born and grew up in a war zone.
We know of the near extermination of the San, or Bushmen, by commandos from Cape Town, because, as they said, the Bushmen were stealing our cattle. And so thousands and thousands of San, or Bushmen, were shot over weekend commandos, like people going hunting. There was the feeling that you could do with what you liked with these people because they weren't quite human. They were subhuman, they were near human, but they weren't us.
This is an actual witness account of a Boer commando raid on a Khoikhoi village.
They surrounded the place during the night, spotting the Bushmen's fires. At daybreak, the firing commenced and lasted until the sun was a little way up. The commando party loaded and fired and reloaded many times before they had finished. A great many people, women and children were fired upon that day. The men were absent. Only a few little children escaped, and they were distributed among the people of the commando. The women threw up their arms for mercy, but no mercy was shown. Great sins were perpetrated that day.
This is probably how the young Sara came to Cape Town.
Quel était le statut, quelle était la position exacte de Saartjie Baartman dans son lieu d'origine? On n'en sait rien. Ce qu'on sait, c'est qu'elle est venue au Cap comme servante. Bon, c'était un mouvement finalement assez fréquent. Lorsque les sociétés Khoikhoi se décomposaient, finalement, les individus n'avaient pas d'autre choix que de s'engager chez des fermiers blancs et de travailler comme serviteur ou de venir au Cap et de trouver un petit travail. Bon, c'est probablement de cette façon-là que Saartjie Baartman est arrivée au Cap de Bonne-Espérance.
She would have been ingebooked, contracted out to a farmer somewhere in the vicinity of Cape Town, or she would have worked for the Cape Corps itself at various public works, building roads, building buildings, doing the core washing, that type of thing. So that is well how she could have ended up on Cezar's farm.
This clumsy amateur sketch is all that remains of the house where Sara worked as a servant until 1810. The farm belonged to Pieter Cezar, a Dutch farmer. In the spring of the same year, Pieter Cezar received two visitors, his brother Hendrik, accompanied by a British surgeon named William Dunlop. The two men knew too well that for the past 2 centuries, Europeans had been fascinated by the Khoikhoi, especially the women. This would explain their immediate interest in the 20-year-old Sara.
The Khoikhoi or Hottentot peoples of southern Africa were particularly interesting to Europeans because they had an almost morbid fascination in the genital and special features of the Khoikhoi people, especially the females. And there had long been rumors in Europe that there were some very special and interesting and unusual features about Khoikhoi ladies' genital anatomy. And although it is today repugnant to us to think about such matters, these early naturalists wanted to find out for themselves, were they, as rumor had held, were they something very different and very special? Behind it, there was a mindset. And the mindset was, are these people really human? There was even a feeling that they didn't belong to our human species, which all the rest of the world belonged to, but they were something apart.
Hendrik Cezar and Alexander Dunlop both knew that if they could convince Sara Baartman to accompany them to Europe, they would make a fortune.
If she was a slave in Cape Town, she had very little choice about her life. Once she was a slave, she had very little choice about where to live, how to live, what to do. It is quite perfectly possible that if it is true, as Hendrik Cezar says, that he came across her on the farm of his brother, that his brother simply gave him to her as one person would give a slave to another and say, take her. You find her bum interesting, take her and do with her as you will.
Il est difficile de dire que Saartjie Baartman est parti librement du Cap pour devenir célèbre et pour faire fortune en Europe, mais il est aussi difficile de dire qu'elle est partie contrainte, mais finalement dans les fers, vers l'Europe. Je crois que la réalité est plus complexe et témoigne finalement de la réalité coloniale au Cap au début du XIXe siècle. Ce qui s'est passé probablement, c'est que deux impresarios ont profité de sa crédulité pour lui faire signer un contrat, pour lui faire miroiter le fait qu'elle deviendrait riche et célèbre et qu'elle pourrait revenir après au Cap. Pourquoi ça marchait si bien, finalement, ça ? Bien, sans doute parce que les conditions économiques dans lesquelles vivaient les Khoikhoi au Cap au début du XIXe siècle étaient tellement déplorables que certains individus, comme Saartjie Baartman, voyaient ce voyage en Europe comme une possibilité d'émancipation économique, comme une possibilité de sortir de leurs conditions, finalement.
Their black population was still mostly living in London and the seaports in various states. On one hand, you can say that the majority of the black people here were of the status which is known as slave servants, that midpoint of servitude, and that's just a fact. On the other hand, you can look at the writings of a noted socialite like Mrs. Hester Piozzi, who noted 8 years before Saartjie turned up in London that there were black ladies in all their finery in the pit at the opera, attending the opera house. At the same time, she also noted black children playing in the squares with their nurses. So although there was a concessionary number of black people who managed to move through society with relative ease, the majority of the community were in some sort of servitude or some sort of beggary.
Uppermost in Hendrik Cezar and Alexander Dunlop's minds was to profit from their rare specimen. They approached William Bullock, the keeper of the Art and Natural History Museum. They offered to sell him Sara Baartman and the giraffe skin. Bullock bought the giraffe skin but refused to buy Sara. Apparently Dunlop panicked and asked Cezar to buy him out of their deal. Cezar, believing he was onto a huge money spinner, began to put his plan into action.
They thought she was a freak because she was different from English women or Scottish women, women in the British Isles whom they knew well. She was different because she had a larger buttocks, than one would find in most British women, and for this they considered her to be freakish. If you were looking at her in Khoikhoi society in the Cape, you would have said, oh, there's nothing special about her. She is a member of her population, no different and not freakish at all.
Sara Baartman's appearance in London was the first physical confirmation of this semi-mythical phenomena which had been in the minds of English travellers, and French travellers even more so, for nearly 200 years. They knew this was odd, but this was the first exhibit, and it was a time, as I say, when we were looking for whatever was new.
Piccadilly was even then a popular entertainment area in the big metropolis. Of all the various thrills on offer, freak shows were the biggest attraction.
Freak shows really started in royal courts. Anything that was different in any nation was taken to the king. We've got them recorded in France in the 1400s. Queen Henrietta Maria in this country had a dwarf who was 18 inches high as her jester. And if you look at Velázquez paintings, the imperial court of Spain and Portugal kept dwarfs who used to play with the royal children, but they were also royal jesters. Now, inevitably, such people sought income outside the court. They often weren't paid inside the court. And what they did was simply to take to fairs and circuses. We exhibited sapient pigs, sapient horses, fleas that could fight, women who were bears, bears who were women, pigs dressed up as women. Anything went. You could not imagine anything in your mind that was not horrific enough or outlandish enough to be exhibited in return for money.
On the 20th of September 1810, Hendrik Cezar published an advertisement in the Morning Post.
Just arrived from the banks of the river Gamtoos on the borders of the Khoikhoi in the interior of South Africa, a most correct and perfect specimen of that race of people. From this extraordinary phenomenon of nature, the people will have an opportunity of judging how far she exceeds any description given by historians of that tribe of human species. She has been brought to this country at a considerable expense by Hendrik Cezar.
Sara Baartman's show, at 2 shillings per head, was an immediate success. Every day, from 1 p.m. until 5 p.m., large crowds would gather at 225 Piccadilly Street.
The extraordinary thing about her exhibition is that somebody drew a cartoon of it. It's in the style of Rowlandson. It may even have been a sketch by him. There stands this young Khoikhoi woman on a plinth. She looks noble, she looks elegant, she's topless, but she's got the traditional Hosa-type apron in front of her. She is looking straight forward. At her foot kneels a woman, peering under her apron, trying to see the pudenda. In front of her are Scottish soldiers. Why did the artist choose Scottish soldiers? Because they wear kilts. Short kilts in this cartoon. And they have long sporrans over their pudenda at the front. But a dog is at the back, sniffing eagerly up the skirt or the kilt of the Scottish soldier as he tries to do the same thing to what the man at the time probably thought was a noble savage. It's a good lesson, and the sympathies of the cartoonist are entirely with the person being exhibited and not with the gawping crowd.
Oh, have you been in London town? It's rare it is to see. There amongst the ladies of renown, the most renowned is she. In Piccadilly Street so fair a mansion she has got, on golden letters written there, the Venus Hottentot. But you may ask, and well I ween, for why she tarries there, and what in her is to be seen than other folks more rare. A rump she has, though strange it be, large as a cauldron pot, and that is why men go to see the lovely Hottentot. Now this was shown for many a day, and eke for many a night, till sober folks began to say that all could not be right. Some said this was with her goodwill, and some said it was not, and asked why they did use so ill the Lady Hottentot.
From the depictions of cartoonists and songwriters of the day, one would imagine that Sara's show was one of the most comical and hilarious of London's many attractions. This was not the case. After witnessing the exhibition, a journalist for the Times newspaper reported,
The exhibition took place on a stage raised about 3 feet from the floor, with a cage or enclosed place at the end of it. The Hottentot was produced like a wild beast and ordered to move backwards and forwards and come out and go into her cage, more like a bear in a chain than a human being. When she refused for a moment to come out of her cage, the keeper let down the curtain, went behind, and was seen to hold up his hand to her in a menacing posture. She then came forward at his call and was perfectly obedient.
It's interesting to note that the Anti-Slavery League and the African Institute in London at that time, which was very strongly abolitionist in favor of abolition of slavery, took up her case, and there was a major press controversy about the degradation which was being made on this poor lady who had been brought from South Africa and was now being demonstrated.
She was extremely ill, and the man insisted on her dancing. The poor creature pointed to her throat and to her knees, as if she felt pain in both, pleading in tears that he should not force her compliance. He declared that she was sulky, produced a long piece of bamboo and shook it at her. She saw it knew its
Between
power.
the 10th and the 29th of October 1810, the Examiner, the Morning Chronicle and the Morning Post published a series of letters expressing shock at Sara Baartman's exhibition.
I allude to that wretched object advertised and publicly shown for money, the Hottentot Venus. I think, sir, that the air of the British Constitution is too pure to permit slavery in the very heart of the metropolis. Your obedient servant, an Englishman. I am, sir, yours, Humanitas. I am, sir, yours, a white man.
Hendrik Cezar's response followed shortly afterwards in the Morning Chronicle. He claimed that the Hottentot Venus was a willing participant in the show, that she was getting a fair share of the profits, and that anyone who could understand her language would hear from herself that she is treated with the utmost humanity, kindness, and tenderness.
The abolitionist movement had gained a major victory in 1806 with the banning of the slave trade. At the time, slavery was still legal throughout the British Empire, except on the grounds of Britain itself. So, to have found a slave on British ground who had come on presumably a British ship from a British colony would have been to undercut their victory in so many different ways. They fought hard to abolish the slave trade. And I suppose it would have felt to them like a slap in the face. So I think this to me was the motivation behind the court case.
The African Institution was an abolitionist movement whose main concern was protecting the rights of freed slaves. On Saturday, November the 24th, 1810, Zachary Macaulay, Thomas Gisborne Baddington, and Peter van Wangener, 3 of its leading members, brought Sara's case before the Court of the King's Bench. The Attorney General sought only an opportunity to ascertain whether the woman was in a state of coercion. He stated,
Before we can remove her from her present situation, we must be satisfied that she is an object capable of making an election.
These then were the issues to be resolved with Sara Baartman, the Hottentot Venus. The court interview lasted 3 hours, and Sara Baartman was asked the questions in Dutch. The following is a transcript of the interview.
She agreed to come to England for a period of 6 years and was promised half of the money for exhibiting herself. Mr. Cezar promised to send her back home after that period at his own expense. She is kindly treated and has everything she wants. She is perfectly happy in her present situation. She has no desire to return back to her own country. She wishes to stay here because she likes this country. She has money given to her by her master, and on Sunday is allowed to ride about in a coach. No personal violence or threats have been used by any individual against her. She even has 2 black boys to wait upon her.
People have analysed this court case as if Sara Baartman was a free agent who felt that she was free, who had an understanding of herself and the situation as if she had a choice. And I tried to explain that if she was a Khoikhoi who grew up in South Africa between 1790 and 1810, this would have been highly unlikely. The only way in which she could have seen herself as a free agent would have been if she was born and bred beyond the frontiers of colonial expansion.
I believe that Saartjie was pressurized by Hendrik Cezar, primed and cued to give these specific answers, such as A, stating her happiness to be in Britain, and B, her contentment at being with Cezar. It can be imagined that she was not educated enough to realize that she might have been able to fashion herself a life away from Cezar. We don't really know what sort of influence that Cezar exerted over Saartjie, but she did make these utterances, and the court stood by those decisions.
She didn't want to go back to the slavery which the governor had just unwittingly imposed upon her people. She certainly knew the story, almost certainly must have known the story, it was common in London, that American slaves brought back here, out of 1,100, 400 went back to Sierra Leone, and within a very short period only 64 of them survived. We didn't know about resistance to disease and antibodies that you build up and lose through generations there. She knew that if she went back, she was either a slave or dead, I believe. Of course she refused. She was a sensible woman.
People tend to think of her as this very, very responsible, mature person. No, she was a kid when she went into exile.
After the introduction of this new evidence, it was clear that the three members of the African institution had no case. Lord Ellenborough, the presiding magistrate, summed up the case by saying,
"If any immodest or indecent exposure of this female stranger should take place, those who have the care of her must know that the law would direct its arm with uplifted resentment against the offending parties."
He then declared the case closed. A few days after the verdict, Sara Baartman and Hendrik Cezar disappeared from London stages. They reappeared 1 year later in Manchester. Fortunately for Sara, this wasn't another sordid exhibition. She was baptized on the 7th of December, 1811. Did this young woman believe that by embracing Christianity, she would gain her freedom? Or did Hendrik Cezar believe that baptizing his Hottentot Venus would gain him respectability? We will never know. This baptism certificate is the last trace of Sara Baartman's stay in England.
Le premier Khoikhoi qui arrive en France. Il y avait déjà eu d'autres Khoikhoi ailleurs en Europe à l'époque antérieure, mais en France, c'est la première Khoikhoi. C'est évidemment pas la première africaine à arriver en France. Il y avait déjà toutes sortes d'Africains en France à cette époque-là. Il faut comprendre le contexte, cependant. L'esclavage n'était pas aboli, il était loin d'être aboli encore en France à cette époque. Le contexte politique, c'est un complexe très trouble. Tension entre la France et l'Angleterre, etc. Passage de l'Empire à la royauté. Le contexte intellectuel, c'est le contexte qui fait suite au voyage de Péron en Afrique du Sud. Dans le contexte politique de l'époque, les savants sont ballottés d'un camp à l'autre. Certains des savants qui examinent Saartjie Baartman en mars 1815 sont des gens qui ont participé à l'expédition égyptienne de Napoléon. Donc il y a tout un contexte extrêmement trouble au plan politique, au plan intellectuel, présence d'Africains en France, et c'est là-dedans, dans ce contexte, que Saartjie Baartman arrive en France et fait scandale, en quelque sorte.
There is no better place in the whole world. Palais Royal will fulfill your wildest fantasies. The latest fashions, art galleries, gambling houses, theatres, music, the best restaurants, brothels. Palais Royal has it all.
This is how a French journalist described the only place to rival Piccadilly of London. We are at the beginning of September 1814. Hendrik Cezar brought Sara through the majestic gardens of the Palais Royal, and there they entered a shop. He sold Sara to an animal trainer named Ryu and disappeared from her life forever. Just across the gardens, Ryu found the best place for his latest attraction. On the 18th of September, the Journal du Paris ran the following article.
Just arrived from London is the Hottentot Venus. She is to be seen at number 15, Rue Neuve des Petits-Champs, from 11 a.m. till 9 p.m. Admittance, 3 francs.
En Angleterre, Saartjie Baartman a été beaucoup caricaturée. Bon. En France, elle n'a pas été tellement caricaturée. On n'a pas tellement de dessins, de représentations d'elle dans la presse. En revanche, on a beaucoup d'écrits de journalistes. Et puis on a surtout des témoignages montrant qu'elle était parodiée. Bon. Mais en personne. Bon. Il y a eu des vaudevilles qui ont été écrits. Un vaudeville, c'est finalement une pièce de théâtre de boulevard mêlant intrigue amoureuse et sexuelle avec le comique. Bon. Cette instrumentalisation de Saartjie Baartman est très intéressante parce que ça mêle à la fois le sexe et l'humour. Et finalement, chose qu'on retrouve dans son nom de Vénus Hottentot. Hein, il y a quelque chose qui fait rire à propos du sexe.
At a typically chic Parisian dinner, where Sara appeared as the special guest, a French journalist recorded the encounter.
Someone announces that a marvel was to come. The doors opened and you could see the Hottentot Venus appearing. At her sight, all our ladies huddle and hide behind a curtain. This poor Venus notices and grows sullen. Her head leans on her chest, tears fall from her eyes. She wears skin-color tight clothes. Her face is flat and her nose is small, but she has huge hips. This is a callipige Venus. Her feet are small, her legs short, and her complexion is light green. To summarize, this is not a very appealing Venus, even more so after seeing the Medici Venus. She jumps, she sings, she plays Basque drums. Someone gives her sweets to encourage her to do this or that trick in her manner. She is, like any other woman, a little stubborn. Sometimes she sulks for nothing. She gets angry for nothing. Her mood changes, though, when you compliment her. Around her neck she wears a tiny piece of turtle shell. She often holds it between her 2 hands, puts it to her lips, and looks up to the sky. I was moved. When the exhibition was over, I offered this stranger a ride home so that she could recount her own story.
My name is Sara. Very unhappy Sara who did not deserve her fate. My father was the head of the hunters, and my mother was the one who organized our festivities. Everybody wanted to marry me. Solka was the one, among others, who touched my heart with his words. Our union was decided. The day was chosen. The tribe was gathered. The fires were lit on the mountains. It was these fires that betrayed us. A terrible battle broke out. I was separated from my companions. Alas, I will not ever see again this sacred land. Poor Sara, your husband, your father, your family, everyone is lost.
The carriage stopped and we got off. I left the stranger and I was deeply touched by her sorrows, but couldn't find a remedy. Imagine, I said to myself, a young French woman who sees barbarians landing on the beaches. They abduct her to an African port. There, she falls into the hands of an Arab who displays her to savages as the Parisian Venus. She cries and she calls for her dear country, hopelessly. She must die far from the people who cherish her. This is the fate of the Hottentot Venus.
Her popularity in the French capital not only satisfied the curiosity of the public, others were prepared to pay a great deal of money for the opportunity to observe an authentic Hottentot in a quiet space.
Georges Cuvier, Étienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire et Blainville étaient parmi les plus éminents naturalistes, comme on disait à l'époque, de France, mais aussi d'Europe. Bon. C'est des gens extrêmement écoutés qui occupaient les chaires les plus importantes des différents instituts scientifiques qui existaient, c'était des gens qui avaient une véritable voix dans le monde, dans l'univers scientifique. D'ailleurs, leurs écrits, aussi bien à Cuvier qu'à Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, leurs écrits sur les Hottentots ont fait date et ont été lus jusqu'à la fin du XIXe siècle.
In the cold spring of 1815, Sara Baartman was observed by Georges Cuvier, de Blainville and Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire at the Jardin du Plant. Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire had requested that Riou make Sara available for scientific examination at the Museum of Natural History. 4 artists were commissioned to draw portraits of her. These 3 scientists had long heard rumor of the Hottentot apron, dubbed so from the accounts of early explorers describing the genitalia of Hottentot women. Cuvier seems to have been disappointed by this first observation.
During this first inspection, we couldn't observe the most remarkable particularity of her anatomy. She hid her apron carefully between her thighs. Her movements were brusque and capricious like those of apes. She had great pendular breasts and the unsightly habit of making her lips protrude, like an orangutan. Her thigh bones were heavy and short like an animal's. Her upper thighs were spindly and delicate like those of apes, dogs and other carnivores.
De Blainville's account is different, however, and is unique in revealing something of what actually went on during those 3 days that spring. According to him, the 3 men had great difficulty in convincing Sara to let herself be seen nude. It was only with great sorrow that she let drop for a moment the handkerchief with which she had been covering her genitals. At one point he offered her money, knowing how much she liked it, hoping in this way to render her more docile, but she refused to take it. After the 3 days of observation at the Jardin du Plant, Saint-Hilaire, at the request of Riou, wrote a certificate detailing his account of the observation. He wrote,
This woman presents a singularly remarkable trait, the prodigious volume of her buttocks. But we will not dwell on this feature, as it can be noticed through direct observation. We noticed that when female apes have disorders in their menstrual cycle, this disorder makes them develop buttocks proportional to the ones we noticed on the Hottentot woman.
Alors pourquoi cette focalisation sur le sexe des Hottentots? Je crois que ce qui est important, c'est qu'à partir du fin 17e, début 18e, le sexe de l'être humain est finalement ce qui contribue à le définir comme être humain. Si des êtres humains présentent une difformité, une monstruosité au niveau de leur sexe, ça en fait moins que des hommes. Ce ne sont plus tout à fait des hommes, ce sont des monstres. Ce sont peut-être une autre race d'hommes, une autre espèce d'hommes, c'est quelque chose d'autre. Bon. Et justement, ce sexe monstrueux des hommes ou des femmes Hottentots participe à ce mouvement qui les inscrit finalement entre l'homme et le singe. Ce sont autre chose que des hommes, justement parce qu'ils ont le sexe monstrueux.
In the 18th century, they had for the longest time been believed to be a different species. And very much the obsession, the white obsession with their genitalia and with their bodily function was very much an obsession of trying to decide, where does the line go? At what point does human stop and animal begin? And for some reason this was a question that was very important to 18th and 19th century Europe to answer.
There was a great sense of the need to classify everybody. Long before the South African Race Classification Act of the Apartheid era, long before then, going back to 1735 in Sweden, when Linnaeus tried to classify everything in the whole world, stones, bones, animals, plants, people. And so the question was in the minds of these European anthropologists and comparative anatomists, were the Khoikhoi people, were they part of the human family? Did they belong to our species?
Far in the distance stands my spirit, observing what has become of this body.
3 months before her supposed contract with Hendrik Cezar was to have expired, Sara Baartman died in the house of Reu. She was 25 years old.
It is all the trees that I am.
Sara Baartman has died on the 1st of January 1816. Her corpse has been given by Mr. Reu to the Museum of Natural History, where her skeleton and a plaster cast of her body will be preserved.
Les scientifiques qui ont disséqué le corps de Saartjie Baartman, sans doute au tout début janvier 1816, ne se sont pas intéressés aux causes de sa mort. Ce qui les a intéressés, c'est tout simplement la mort de Saartjie Baartman. C'est qu'ils avaient un corps à disséquer. C'était une aubaine, finalement, pour eux, la mort de Saartjie Baartman. Les causes, ça passait totalement inaperçu. Peu importe, pour eux, les causes de la mort de Saartjie Baartman. Ils avaient enfin un corps qu'ils pouvaient disséquer, un corps qui ne résistait pas.
Georges Cuvier made a plaster cast of her body. Her brain was removed and stored in a glass jar. Her genitals were cut out and also preserved. Her skeleton stands to this very day in perfect condition at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. After his dissection, Cuvier presented his findings to the Academy of Science.
I have the honour of presenting to the Academy the genitals of this woman, prepared in such a way as to leave no doubt about the exact nature of the Hottentot apron.
Il a fait une description qui était à la fois très anatomique, très exagérée et fondamentalement raciste. Il est clair que la description de l'autopsie de Saartjie Baartman par Cuvier est un des meilleurs témoignages de l'omniprésence des préjugés dans toute activité scientifique et de la manière dont les observations peuvent être déformées. Parce que quand vous regardez ici Saartjie Baartman, vous regardez son squelette, c'est un squelette de femme moderne comme n'importe quelle femme d'aujourd'hui. Elle n'a absolument aucune particularité autre que sa petite taille. Et dans des quantités de population, on a des hommes et des femmes qui ont une taille aussi petite ou plus petite que celle de Saartjie.
Scientific racism originated very much in the post-Sara Baartman period. Like I say, it was built on her body. These forms of conclusions, this type of theory was built upon the body of her and the many women that followed her. I mean, there have been at least another 5 Hottentot Venuses in the 19th century.
Sara Baartman's skeleton and plaster cast were on public display at the Musée de l'Homme until 1974. Surprisingly, though, her brain and genitals have disappeared. Is it possible that Sara's missing organs are here, among these many anonymous bottles, still under the watchful eyes of Georges Cuvier?
Alors, moi, la seule chose que je peux vous dire, c'est que je suis responsable de ce laboratoire depuis 1987. J'ai eu de nombreuses interrogations concernant des bocaux anatomiques dans lesquels il y aurait eu des restes de Saartjie Baartman. Nous n'avons pas ça dans nos collections ici. Alors, est-ce que cela a certainement existé puisqu'on en parle tellement, mais je ne sais pas ce que c'est devenu. Quand le laboratoire d'anthropologie du Musée de l'Homme a été créé, une partie seulement des collections qui étaient au laboratoire d'anatomie comparée et au précédent laboratoire d'anthropologie au Jardin des Plantes ont été déménagées ici. Et en particulier, les pièces anatomiques, généralement, sont restées au Jardin des Plantes. Certaines sont revenues ici, mais nous n'avons pas ces pièces parmi notre collection.
Oh, she must be buried, of course. She must be buried. Khoikhoi religious belief would say that her soul cannot be at rest until her body is respected. I mean, to put in a glass case, to chop a body up to pieces and put various parts of it in various glass cases and let people come see it, there is just no way it can be respectful. In Khoikhoi culture, it is not respectful. And certainly, although her soul has left her body, in Khoikhoi religious belief, the body itself has to be the focus of certain religious observances. The very fact that these observances are not taking place for almost 2 centuries it's wrong. It is bad. It is bad for her spirit, and it is bad for the spirit of everyone that had a hand in it.
We are negotiating with the French museum and governmental authorities, and the negotiations at this moment are still ongoing. It is the hope of many of us that because of the profound political and symbolic and historical significance which would follow the return of Saartjie Baartman's remains, that they should be returned. I have no doubt in my mind that this is the ideal thing to do, to bring them back to the land of her birth in dignity and respect for what was the remains of a person who had been treated with indignity and disrespect in her lifetime. And so I feel very emphatically that those remains should come back to South Africa. Now, the question is, to whom should the remains be returned? And there is no doubt in my mind they should be returned to the South African government.
Surtout, je ne voudrais pas que si Saartjie Baartman, un jour, par exemple, devait, par suite à une décision politique qui ne dépend pas du tout de moi, mais devait retourner ici en Afrique du Sud ou ailleurs, je ne souhaiterais pas du tout qu'elle soit un objet de division entre les Sud-Africains, qu'elle soit l'occasion de donner, de présenter des revendications des Khoikhoi ou des Griqua ou de je ne sais qui contre le reste de la population sud-africaine ou bien contre le gouvernement qui maltraiterait les minorités. J'ai l'impression que dans l'exploitation qui a été faite de son cas, il se trouve quelque chose que nous avons vu souvent ces dernières années, quand des mouvements prétendus indigénistes et qui prétendaient défendre des minorités de population contre des majorités ont été beaucoup stimulés par un certain nombre de personnes, en particulier aux États-Unis et au Canada.
I'm not going to suggest that everybody who's ever been dug up should be put back into the ground. Science would come to a standstill if that were followed. But I believe that the government could erect a shrine for her, perhaps in Cape Town, from which she was recruited to Britain, at which Khoikhoi people themselves could be the curators and custodians of her remains, with panels reflecting this tragic history of Saartjie Baartman, the Hottentot Venus.
I'm going back to Africa. I'm going back, that's where I belong. Beautiful faces, beautiful country, beautiful people, African music. I'm going back to Africa.
The differences between the South African government and the descendants of the Khoi people over who owns Sara Baartman have been resolved. What has been agreed is that she must be returned to her motherland, where her story must be preserved for future generations. The question still remains, will she be returned?